The city noise still hummed in my ears even behind the closed door that Thursday morning. Groggy from a night where sleep played hide and seek, I yanked it open, not expecting anyone. Jake stood there, a surprise package on my doorstep. He had that fresh-faced look, the kind that screamed early 20s, going places. Smooth skin, bright eyes that missed nothing, and just a hint of stubble like he was trying on maturity for size. His white tee was stretched tight over his chest and biceps, a tool belt riding low on his hips. In one hand, he held a toolbox, red and gleaming like a brand new sports car in the morning sun. Everything about him, from his eager stance to the way he shifted his weight, telegraphed way too young for this. "You must be Sarah," he said, his voice softer than I expected, but steady, a nice contrast to the city's usual blare. He gave me a polite, almost shy smile. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, suddenly feeling too exposed in my robe even though it was belted tight. "You're here about the window?" He nodded, smile widening just a fraction. "Yeah, got your message. Latch giving you trouble, right?" "That's right," I said, stepping back to let him in. As Jake brushed past, a scent of soap and something like fresh-cut wood followed him, a clean, masculine smell that lingered in the air like a promise. He moved with the casual confidence of someone used to working with his hands, but there was also a hesitant air, his eyes darting around my apartment like he was afraid to break something. I couldn't blame him. This place probably wasn't on the usual route for guys like him. My apartment, high up in a building overlooking Central Park, was large, meticulously kept, but felt empty. It was a space meant for a life that had expanded and then contracted, leaving behind echoes. The high ceilings, the pristine furniture, remnants of a time when noise and laughter had bounced off these walls, when kids and conversations filled the rooms. Now, it was just me and the quiet. "It's over here," I said, leading him towards the sunroom. Morning light streamed in through the wide glass windows, painting the room in gold. The faulty window was in the corner. Jake set his toolbox down, the metallic clang cutting through the silence, and got straight to work. I stood a few feet back, watching as he examined the latch, his large hands surprisingly deft, unscrewing the handle, exploring the mechanism. His movements were sure yet careful, and I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the soft click of his tools and the distant city sounds filtering through the glass. I pretended to straighten a stack of magazines on the coffee table, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. There was something captivating in his focused energy, something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. It had been 3 years since Michael died. 3 years of adjusting to life alone. Mostly, I thought I had. But seeing Jake here, his youthful vitality filling the space, made the silence in my life suddenly feel deafening. "You keep it really nice in here," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes warm, sincere. "Thank you," I said, a smile surprising me. "I try. Keeps me busy. It's a little big for just me, though." He nodded, like he understood, though I doubted he really did. He couldn't have been older than 27. What did someone like him know about empty apartments, empty lives? I folded my arms, leaning against the doorframe, watching as he went back to work. The sun streamed through the windows, catching the fine hairs on his tanned skin, making the veins on his forearms stand out as he tightened a screw. His sandy brown hair, damp with the morning warmth, curled slightly at the nape of his neck. Something stirred inside me, something dormant, a flicker of a feeling I thought I'd buried deep. It wasn't just attraction, though that was there, undeniable. It was a kind of longing, a faint echo of something lost. It was the way he filled the space, the sheer life of him. There was a vitality that drew me in, like a moth to a flame. "Does this happen often?" Jake asked, pulling me from my thoughts. He gestured to the latch. "Not really," I said, stepping closer to where he knelt by the window. "It's just old, like everything else in this place." He laughed softly, a low, pleasant sound that did something unexpected to my stomach. "Old doesn't mean bad," he said, glancing up, a grin playing on his lips. His words hung in the air, longer than they should have, and I felt a blush creep up my neck. I cleared my throat, suddenly self-conscious, and took a step back. "Well, as long as it still works, I suppose," I said lightly, trying to brush off the sudden tension. He nodded, turning back to the window, but I noticed his hands moved a little more deliberately now, like he was focusing harder than necessary. By the time Jake finished the repair, I felt both relief and a strange disappointment. Relief because the charged air between us was starting to unnerve me, and disappointed because, well, I wasn't quite ready for him to leave. "All done," he said, standing up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Should be good as new." "Thank you," I said, walking him to the front door. As he stepped out into the hallway, he turned back, looking at me for a moment. I thought I saw something in his eyes, a flicker of hesitation, like he wanted to say something more but couldn't find the words. "Let me know if you need anything else," he said finally, his voice quiet, sincere. "I will," I replied, watching as he walked towards the elevator, his broad shoulders outlined against the hallway light. When the door swished shut behind him, the apartment felt even quieter than before. But this time, the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite name. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, my mind replaying the way Jake had looked at me, the way his laugh had made me feel like someone had flipped a switch inside me. I hadn't planned on feeling anything when I called him. It was just supposed to be a repair, nothing more. But as I walked back into the sunroom and sat down in the chair by the window, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His hands, his voice, the way his presence had filled the space. It was nothing, I told myself. A silly, fleeting thought. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I wanted it to shift back. The next few days dragged by. I went through the motions of my usual routine, watering the plants, sorting through mail, preparing dinner for one. But something was different. The apartment didn't feel quite as empty anymore. Jake's presence lingered in the corners of my mind. I found myself replaying the way his hands moved as he tightened the latch, the quiet hum of his voice as he worked, the way he smiled when he spoke to me. It wasn't just his looks, though those certainly hadn't gone unnoticed. It was the energy he carried, the way he seemed to breathe life back into the apartment, if only for a little while. I told myself it was ridiculous. He was just a handyman, a young guy doing his job. There was nothing more to it. But even as I tried to push the thoughts away, they kept creeping back, uninvited. It didn't help that I found an excuse to call him again. The excuse was as flimsy as the supposed issue I discovered with the lock on the back door. It was sticking slightly when I turned the key, but nothing I couldn't have handled myself. Still, I picked up the phone and dialed his number. My heart hammered against my ribs as I waited for him to answer. "Hello?" His voice was soft, polite, but there was a hint of surprise when I introduced myself. "Hi, Jake, it's Sarah. You came by the other day to fix my window?" "Of course, Mrs. Davison," he said, recognition clear in his tone. "Everything okay with the window?" "The window's fine," I replied quickly. "It's just, there's a problem with the back door lock now. It's probably nothing, but I thought it'd be better to have you take a look." There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment I thought he might say he was too busy, too booked. But then he said, "I can be there this afternoon if that works for you." "That's perfect," I said, trying to keep the relief out of my voice. When Jake arrived later that day, the same nervous energy I'd felt the first time returned. Stronger now that I'd had days to obsess over it. He was wearing a navy t-shirt this time, paired with jeans that were slightly frayed at the edges, like they'd seen 1,000 jobs. But on him, they looked right. I led him to the back door, explaining the issue in what I hoped was a casual tone. He nodded as I spoke, his eyes focused on the lock. "This should be a quick fix," he said, kneeling to inspect it. I stood nearby, leaning against the kitchen counter, watching as he worked. There was something about the way he moved, deliberate, confident, but not arrogant. It was the kind of confidence that came from knowing your craft, not needing to show off. "Do you do this kind of work full-time?" I asked, breaking the silence. He glanced up at me, his eyes warm but guarded. "For now, yeah. Been doing it for a couple of years. Keeps me busy." "Do you enjoy it?" He shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's not bad. I like working with my hands, fixing things." I nodded, though I wasn't really listening to his words anymore. I was watching the way his hands moved, the way his forearms flexed as he tightened a screw. For a moment, I caught myself staring, and quickly looked away, pretending to adjust a vase of flowers on the counter. But when I glanced back, I saw that Jake had noticed. His cheeks were slightly flushed, and he was avoiding my gaze, focusing intently on the lock. The air between us felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken. A rush of adrenaline, a mix of excitement and nerves, made my hands tremble slightly. "It's nice to have someone around who knows what they're doing," I said, my voice softer than I'd intended. Jake looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "You probably could have fixed this yourself," he said with a small laugh. "It's a pretty simple job." "Maybe," I replied, stepping closer. "But I like having you here." The words hung in the air. For a moment, neither of us moved. Jake's hands stilled, and he slowly looked up at me, his eyes wide and uncertain. I could see the conflict in his expression, the way he was trying to decide whether to stay or pull away, but he didn't move. I stepped closer again, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. My heart was pounding in my chest. I knew I was crossing a line, but I didn't care. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes?" His gaze flicked to my lips, then back to my eyes. For a moment, I thought he might lean in, might close the distance between us. But then he shook his head, stepping back slightly. I should finish this," he said, his voice strained. I nodded, stepping back as well, though my body was still buzzing with the tension that hung between us. For the rest of the visit, we kept things strictly professional. Jake finished fixing the lock, and I thanked him, my voice overly bright in an attempt to dispel the awkwardness. He packed up his tools and left, his goodbyes polite but hurried. When the door closed behind him, I let out a shaky breath, pressing my hand to my chest to steady my racing heart. I told myself that calling him back was about the door, but now I knew better. It wasn't about the lock, or the window, or anything else in the apartment. It was about him. And for the first time in years, I felt alive. The phone call came just a week later, but it wasn't about another repair. "Hey, Mrs. Davison," Jake said, his voice hesitant but warmer this time. "It's Daniel. I was just calling to check in. Is the door working okay?" The question was innocent enough, but the tone wasn't. There was a subtle crack in his professionalism, a flicker of something unspoken that I couldn't ignore. "The door's fine," I said, my voice steady though my stomach fluttered. "But since you're asking, there is something else you might be able to help me with." There was a long pause. I imagined him debating whether to take the bait. Finally, he said, "What's going on?" "It's the light in the sunroom," I lied. "It keeps flickering. I think it's the wiring, but I'd feel better if you looked at it." "All right," he said slowly. "I can swing by this afternoon." When Jake arrived, I could sense the change in him immediately. He was nervous, more so than last time, but he was trying to hide it. His polite smile faltered as he stepped inside, and I noticed the way his hands fidgeted at his sides. "It's just the light fixture in here," I said, leading him to the sunroom. He nodded, setting his toolbox down and reaching for the light switch. "I'll take a look." I lingered near the doorway, pretending to busy myself with the plants on the shelf, but my attention was fixed entirely on him, on the way his muscles flexed as he stretched up to inspect the fixture, on the way his jaw tightened in concentration. "How's it looking?" I asked, after a few minutes stepping closer. "It's probably just a loose wire," he said without looking at me. "I can tighten it up." He climbed down from the small step stool, brushing his hands off on his jeans. I watched him, unable to tear my eyes away from the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, the way his shirt clung to his back. "You've been a big help around here," I said softly, moving closer. "I don't know what I'd do without you." He froze for a moment, then turned to face me. His expression was guarded, his eyes searching mine as if trying to figure out what I meant. "It's just my job," he said, but his voice was quieter now, unsure. I stepped even closer, close enough to see the faint stubble on his jaw, the way his Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "Maybe," I said, my voice dropping, "but you've been more than that to me." Jake's breath hitched, and I saw the conflict flicker across his face. His eyes darted to the floor, then back to mine. For a moment, the tension between us was almost unbearable. "I don't," he started, but his voice trailed off. I reached out, brushing my fingers lightly against his forearm. His skin was warm under my touch, and I felt the faint tremor in his muscles. "You don't have to think," I whispered. "Just let it happen." His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw the exact moment he gave in. His hands moved to my waist, hesitant at first, but growing firmer as he pulled me closer. His lips met mine in a rush of heat and urgency. The kiss was clumsy, desperate, but filled with a raw intensity that made my knees weak. I melted into him, my hands gripping his shoulders as I kissed him back, letting myself get swept up in the moment. His body was solid and warm against mine, and I felt a spark ignite deep inside me, a spark I hadn't felt in years. "Sarah," he murmured against my lips, his voice thick with need. "Shh," I said, tugging him closer. "Don't stop." He didn't. The sunroom wasn't enough for what was building between us. Without thinking, I led him through the apartment, down the hall to my bedroom. He followed, his hands roaming over my back, his lips trailing kisses along my jawline. By the time we reached the bedroom, the tension had boiled over into something we couldn't control. He pressed me against the mattress, his weight grounding me, his touch setting every nerve in my body alight. There was nothing tentative about the way he moved now. His earlier hesitance was gone, replaced by an urgency that took my breath away. His hands explored my body with a mix of reverence and hunger, and I couldn't help but respond in kind, my own hands sliding under his shirt, tracing the lines of his back. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the bed, the room filled with the quiet hum of our breathing. Jake's arm was draped over my waist, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my skin. "I shouldn't have done that," he said softly, breaking the silence. "Why not?" I asked, turning to look at him. He hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Because, I don't know, it feels like I crossed a line." I smiled faintly, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from his forehead. We both crossed it. He nodded, but I could see the conflict still flickering in his eyes. "I don't want you to think I was taking advantage," he said, "or that this was just, I don't know, a fling." "I don't think that," I said firmly. "I wanted this as much as you did." He didn't respond right away. For a moment, we just lay there in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over us. Eventually, Jake sat up, running a hand through his hair. "I should go," he said, his voice reluctant. "You don't have to," I said, though I knew he would. He shook his head. I need some time to think." I watched as he got dressed, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were giving himself time to process what had just happened. When he finally turned to leave, he paused at the door, glancing back at me. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft. "I don't regret it, but I don't know what this means." "Neither do I admitted. He nodded, his expression conflicted, then slipped out the door. The apartment felt impossibly quiet after he left. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I hadn't planned for this. I hadn't planned to feel anything for Jake beyond gratitude for his repairs. But now, after what had just happened, I couldn't ignore the truth. I wanted him, and I wasn't ready to let him go. The hours after Jake left were a haze of restless energy and unanswered questions. I paced around the apartment, replaying every detail of what had happened in my mind, the way he'd looked at me, the way his hands had trembled against my skin, and the way he'd kissed me, like he was unraveling, unable to stop himself. It was intoxicating, yes, but it was also terrifying. I hadn't felt like this in years, this mix of exhilaration and vulnerability. For so long, I had lived in a world where emotion stayed buried, where I didn't allow myself to want anything more than what I already had. And then Jake had stepped through my door, and suddenly everything felt alive again. But now that he was gone, all that energy was turning into doubt. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Jake hadn't called, and I hadn't reached out either. Part of me wanted to. It would have been so easy to text him, to ask him to come back under the guise of fixing something else. But I didn't. Instead, I threw myself into distractions. I cleaned the apartment from top to bottom, reorganized the pantry, and even ventured out to a local bookstore, where I wandered the aisles aimlessly, not really looking for anything. Still, no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the lingering feeling of him. The warmth of his hands, the sound of his laugh, the way he'd whispered my name like it meant something. I told myself it was just a fling, a moment of weakness for both of us. But it didn't feel that simple. On the fourth day, just as I was beginning to think I wouldn't hear from him again, my phone rang. "Sarah," he said, his voice hesitant but familiar. "It's Jake. I've been thinking about the other day." My heart raced, and I had to take a deep breath before I answered. "So have I admitted, my voice softer now. He let out a shaky laugh. "Yeah, I figured. Look, I don't regret it. I need you to know that, but I don't know how to handle this." "Neither do I said honestly. "Can I come over?" he asked. The question caught me off guard, but I didn't hesitate. Of course. Jake arrived that evening looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, as if debating whether to come inside, before finally stepping in. We sat in the living room, the air between us thick with tension. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way his fingers fidgeted with the edge of his jeans. "I don't want you to think I'm running away," he said after a long silence, "but I'm scared of what this means." "What are you scared of?" I asked gently. He hesitated, his brow furrowing. "The age difference, for one. What people would think, and I don't know if I'm what you need. You're amazing, Sarah. You've got this life, this apartment, and you seem so put together, and me, I'm just a guy trying to figure things out." I reached out, placing my hand on his. His skin was warm, his fingers twitching slightly under my touch. "Jake, I don't care what people think, and as for the rest, I'm not looking for perfection. I'm not even looking for promises. I just know that when I'm with you, I feel alive again, and that's enough for me." He looked at me then, his eyes softening. "You make me feel the same way, like I don't have to try so hard to prove myself." Then stop trying, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He exhaled slowly, as if letting go of something he'd been holding on to for too long. Okay, he said finally, but I don't want to hurt you. I need you to know that. You're not hurting me, I said, squeezing his hand. For the first time that night, he smiled. Over the next few weeks, Jake and I found ourselves navigating the strange, uncharted waters of whatever this was between us. It wasn't a relationship, not in the traditional sense, but it wasn't casual either. He came over often, sometimes under the pretense of fixing something, sometimes just to sit and talk. We would spend hours together, talking about everything and nothing. I learned that he loved classic rock, that he'd spent 2 years working construction before switching to handyman work, and that he had an older sister who lived in California. He learned about Michael, about the kids who visited only occasionally now that they had families of their own, and about the small dreams I'd abandoned over the years, traveling, painting, learning to salsa. Our connection deepened, but so did the complications. It wasn't long before the cracks began to show. One afternoon, as we sat together in the sunroom, Jake mentioned his friends. They don't know about us, he said, his tone cautious. Should they? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. I don't know, he admitted. It's just, they wouldn't get it. They'd think it's weird. Weird? I repeated, feeling a sting of hurt. That's not what I mean, he said quickly. It's just, you know how people are. They judge, and I don't want them to think badly of you. I nodded, though his words lingered in my mind long after the conversation ended. The age gap, which had once felt thrilling, now loomed over us like a shadow. I noticed the way people stared when we went out in public. The cashier at the deli, the couple at the coffee shop. Their glances weren't overtly hostile, but they were noticeable enough to make Jake shift uncomfortably and avoid meeting their eyes. At first, I brushed it off, but as time went on, I began to feel the weight of their judgment too. One night, after Jake had left, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the empty wine glass in my hand. The apartment felt too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed in on me like a weight. I thought about what he'd said, about people not understanding, about their judgment. I couldn't blame him for feeling that way. I felt it too, in the stares and whispers, in the little voice in the back of my mind that kept asking, "What are you doing?" I told myself it didn't matter, that what we had was real and that was enough. But the doubts were harder to ignore now, creeping into the edges of my thoughts like shadows I couldn't escape. And for the first time, I wondered if we were both in over our heads. It started small, like a crack in a window that's easy to ignore until it spiderwebs across the entire surface. Jake began coming by less often. At first, it was subtle. He'd text to say he couldn't make it one day, but promised to stop by the next. And when he did come, he seemed distracted. His usual easy smile replaced with something tighter, forced. I told myself it was just life getting in the way. He was young, busy, probably juggling other jobs, maybe friends, maybe family. But deep down, I knew better. The hesitation in his voice, the way he avoided my gaze when we talked, it was all too familiar. One afternoon, I decided to address it. "Is everything okay?" I asked, as he sat on the edge of my couch, his hands clasped together, his toolbox untouched by the door. "Yeah," he said too quickly. "Jake," I said softly, reaching for his hand. "You've been distant. Talk to me." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "It's not you," he said after a long pause. "It's everything else." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then finally met my eyes. I didn't think this would get so complicated. The next blow came a week later. We had gone to a local hardware store together, something we'd done a few times before, though we usually kept a low profile. But that day, as we walked down one of the aisles, I noticed the way people were looking at us. It wasn't just the casual glances I was used to. This time, the stares lingered, and I could almost hear the unspoken questions hanging in the air. One woman, a middle-aged customer with a cart full of garden supplies, gave us a look that made my stomach twist. It wasn't overtly hostile, but it was judgmental, her eyes flicking between me and Jake as if she were trying to piece together what we were doing together. I tried to brush it off, but Jake noticed too. I saw the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders stiffened, as he avoided looking at anyone. When we got back to the car, the silence between us was heavy. "They were staring," he said finally, his voice tight. "Let them stare," I replied, though my own voice didn't carry as much conviction as I wanted it to. He shook his head, gripping the steering wheel. "It's not that simple, Sarah. They don't get it. They don't understand." "Why does it matter what they think?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Because it's not just them, he said, his voice rising slightly. It's my friends, my family, people I know, people I care about. I don't want them looking at me like I'm doing something wrong. I didn't respond. There was nothing I could say that wouldn't sound defensive, and I wasn't sure I wanted to fight about it. But his words stayed with me long after the car ride home. The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling. Jake became more distant, his texts fewer and farther between. When he did come over, it felt like there was a wall between us, an unspoken tension that neither of us wanted to address. I tried to act like everything was normal, but it wasn't. The laughter we used to share, the quiet intimacy of sitting together in the sunroom, it was all fading. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. "Jake," I said, turning to face him, "what's going on?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know how to do this, Sarah. I don't know how to make this work." "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I care about you," he said, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and sadness. "But it's not sustainable. The age difference, the way people look at us, it's always there, hanging over me, and I don't know how to deal with it." I felt my heart sink, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I don't care about any of that," I said. "I care about you." "I know," he said, his voice cracking. "But I do. I can't help it. Every time I leave here, I feel like I'm living two lives, and it's tearing me up inside." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him that we could make it work if we just tried harder. But another part of me knew it wouldn't change anything. "I never wanted this to hurt you," he said softly. "I never wanted to hurt either of us." A few days later, Jake came over for what would be the last time. I knew it as soon as I saw him standing in the doorway, his shoulders slumped, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't quite name. We sat in the living room, the same place where so much of our story had played out. But this time, the silence wasn't filled with anticipation or tension. It was just sad. "I think we need to stop," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though the lump in my throat made it hard to speak. "It's not because I don't care," he continued, his hands gripping his knees. "It's because I care too much, and I don't want this to end in resentment or pain." I wanted to tell him that it was already too late for that the pain had already settled deep in my chest, but I stayed quiet, letting him say what he needed to say. "You've been amazing," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "You've shown me so much about myself, about what I want, but I don't think I can give you what you deserve." "You gave me more than I expected," I said finally, my voice trembling, "and I don't regret a single moment." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. "I don't regret it either." For a long time, we just sat there, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of us. And then, slowly, he stood, his movements hesitant, as if he didn't want to leave. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," he said softly. "You too, Jake," I replied. And just like that, he was gone. The apartment felt impossibly empty after he left, the silence louder than it had ever been. I wandered from room to room, replaying our final conversation in my mind, trying to hold on to the pieces of him that were still here. The faint scent of his cologne, the indent on the couch where he'd been sitting. But as the hours turned into days, I knew I had to let him go. I had known from the beginning that this was temporary, that what we'd shared couldn't last. But knowing it didn't make it any easier. For days after Jake left, I felt like I was drifting. The apartment, already too big for one person, now felt cavernous. I moved through it like a ghost, haunted by memories of him. Every corner seemed to hold a piece of us, a laugh we shared, a touch that lingered, a kiss that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. At first, I tried to keep myself busy. I cleaned the apartment obsessively, scrubbing the counters until they gleamed, and reorganizing shelves that didn't need reorganizing. But no matter how hard I worked, the silence pressed in. It was the kind of quiet that gets under your skin, gnawing at the edges of your thoughts until you can't think about anything else. I missed him more than I wanted to admit. I told myself it would get easier, that the ache in my chest would fade with time. But some mornings I woke up expecting to hear his knock at the door, to see his nervous smile and the way his hands fidgeted when he didn't know what to say. I started avoiding the sunroom. It was where so much had started, where the tension between us had first crackled to life. I couldn't sit in there without seeing him standing by the window, tools in hand, or hearing the faint echo of his laugh. Even little things became reminders. The hardware store bag on the counter, the faint scuff marks on the floor where he'd knelt to fix the back door lock, the toolbox catalog he'd left behind. One afternoon, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I tried to rationalize it, This wasn't a breakup, not in the conventional sense. Jake and I hadn't made promises to each other. There had been no declarations of love, no plans for a future. What we had was fleeting, fragile, and built on borrowed time. But that didn't make it hurt any less. One night, unable to sleep, I sat down at the small desk in my bedroom and began to write. I didn't know what I intended to do with the letter, but the words poured out of me anyway. Dear Jake, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. I miss you. I miss the way you filled this apartment with life, the way you made me laugh, the way you looked at me like I wasn't invisible. You made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been in years, and I'll always be grateful for that. I know we did the right thing by letting go. You have your whole life ahead of you, and I never wanted to hold you back. But I hope you know that what we had was real. It mattered. You mattered. Take care of yourself, Jake. I'll always remember you. I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer, knowing I'd never send it. The turning point came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I was sitting on the balcony watching the sun dip low on the horizon when it hit me. I didn't regret any of it, not a single moment. Jake had come into my life like a flash of lightning, illuminating everything I'd forgotten about myself. What it meant to feel desire, to feel wanted, to feel alive. And even though he was gone, the changes he'd sparked in me remained. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I began to reclaim my space. The sunroom, once filled with memories of him, became my sanctuary again. I bought a set of paints and started filling the blank canvases I'd kept stored in the closet for years. The vibrant colors felt like a reflection of the life I was rediscovering, piece by piece. I reached out to old friends I hadn't spoken to in years, reconnecting over brunch and long phone calls. I joined a local book club, something I'd always meant to do but had never found the time for. Slowly, I began to fill the spaces in my life that had once felt so empty. Months passed, and the ache of missing Jake began to fade. It didn't disappear entirely. Some nights, I still thought about him, wondered where he was, what he was doing, but the memories no longer felt like a weight I couldn't carry. One afternoon, as I was tidying up the apartment, I came across the letter I'd written to him. I unfolded it, reading the words I'd poured onto the page so many weeks ago. This time, I smiled. I didn't feel the need to keep it anymore. Carefully, I tore the letter into small pieces and tossed them into the trash. Some things are meant to be let go. One evening, as I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine in hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The city stretched out before me, the lights twinkling like stars against the darkening sky. The air, still warm from the day, carried the distant sound of sirens and the murmur of life. I thought about the future, about the endless possibilities that still lay ahead. Jake had reminded me that it was never too late to feel, to want, to live. And for that, I would always be grateful. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I raised my glass to the quiet, unspoken promise of tomorrow. Life was still waiting for me, and I was ready to meet it.